Hello, everyone. I'm hoping that people can hear me. I'm Gretchen Grosier. I am the president of the Jamaica Plain Historical Society, and we're very excited to have you here today for this talk on the China trade. This talk came about because one of our members from the JP Historical Society noticed that in Jamaica Plain, we have a lot of tours or streets that are named for families that have a connection to the China trade, Perkins Street and Forbes Street. And she said, we should have a talk about that. So I talked to one of our to be the speaker, and we connected with him, and sure enough, it's all happened. Of course, we were supposed to have this talk last spring in April of 2020 and had to cancel it, but luckily history is one of those things that if you have to schedule around a pandemic, you can. So that's what happened. So we are back in a virtual format instead of being at the Arnold Arboretum, Honeywell Hall, but that's okay because we have quite a few people on the talk today, and that means that we can all be here. We would have had been turning people away from physical locations. I'm very excited to let you know that as part of our offerings today, we heard from the Forbes House Museum. Dane has actually been working with them on an upcoming exhibit, which I think you'll hear about. But what they have offered everybody who's attending the talk today is a 2-for-1 pass for a guided tour of the Forbes House Museum over at Milton. They're closed for renovations right now, but they're going to be open in April. So everybody will get an email after this talk with all the details. Basically, you can go over there and learn more about the Forbes family and their connections with the China trade. So look for that email later this afternoon. And then because I have a captive audience, I want to just point out that we do have a whole series of talks coming up in a virtual format, 3 in April. Book talks, one on Anthony Samarco is going to be doing a talk on his new book, Jamaica Plain Through Time. That's coming up on April 7th. We also have Heather Clark, who is the author of Red Comet, The Short Life and Blazing Path of Sylvia Plath. Sylvia Plath, born in Jamaica Plain, as many people maybe don't know. That was originally scheduled for later this week, but because she's up for the National Book Critics Circle Award, she has to go to that award ceremony. So we've rescheduled that for April 15th. And then we also have a talk in April on the remarkable photos of Leon Abdalian, another talk that we had originally hoped to have in 2020 that's been rescheduled. And then finally, another book talk in March on Boston's oldest buildings and where to find them. That's a new book by Joe Bagley, our city archaeologist. And our 26th season of historic walking tours will start sometime in May or June. We're not quite sure of the starting date yet. We're going to kind of look at vaccine rates and play it by ear, but those are coming up. So you can go to jphs.org, our website, and go to the events page and sign up for any or all of those as you wish. So without further ado, I am now going to introduce Dane Morrison, who will take us on a talk about the China trade.
So let's see. So I'm going to do a share screen. And I'm going to do presenter view. Well, how's that? Can you see that?
Yes.
Yeah, it looks great.
Okay, thank you. Well, welcome everyone. Gosh, I want to thank Gretchen and the Jamaica Plain Historical Society for bringing us all together now. We have, as mariners used to say, we have been in irons for the past year. It's been difficult even trying to schedule this talk. So today we're going to get out a little bit and we're going to make a voyage, a vicarious voyage to China. We're going to talk today about what the experience of the China trade was like through the eyes of this man as he looked back on his 85 years of trial and trouble and success and celebrity. His name was Robert Bennett Forbes, a name that will be familiar to most of us. And in his wonderful, wonderful memoir called Personal Reminiscences, he recalled the beginning of things. He put it like this: I was born at Jamaica Plain in a farmhouse, which stood on the corner of Perkins Street. My mother was then a resident of New York, visiting her brother's residence at Pine Banks. Speaking of his birth, he went on, the important event occurred on the 18th September 1804. I have heard it intimated that I weighed something under 5 pounds, and that gave doubts as to whether I should ever come to anything useful. So a rather inauspicious beginning, he thinks, but as we'll see, he did go on to do some very useful things. 3 years later, in 1807, the family moved to Boston, and Forbes began a lifetime of travels that would bring him to Europe and the Ottoman Empire, around the Cape of Good Hope, to Java, to Sumatra, to the Pacific Ocean, to Manila, and of course to China. And we're using here a map from 1796 to try to see the world as young Forbes would have seen it. This cost $9 in 1796, which would have been roughly a month's wages for a typical sailor, so rather beyond the reach of an ordinary mariner. We're going to draw today on a recent book, not so recent anymore, True Yankees, and a forthcoming book to tell Forbes' story. And we're also going to draw on his wonderful publications, letters, journals, correspondence, and so on, that documented a lifetime devoted to, in his terms, being useful and amassing a fortune in what was then called the old China trade. Historians often use terms such as adventure, romance, enterprise to describe the old China trade. And yet, within Forbes's writing, there's a problematic undercurrent, an undercurrent that records a darker side of this American experience. Alongside all of his successes, Forbes was also a participant in the emergence of colonialism, imperialism, racism, the opium trade, and so on. And we will include this as part of our story. I am not here to praise Caesar or to condemn him today, but rather what we want to do as historians is to try to understand how the fullness of his life helps us to appreciate one strand of this American experience. Along with his brothers, Thomas Tunno Forbes, John Murray Forbes, Samuel Forbes, Robert Bennett Forbes, known generally to his friends and kin, known as Bennett. Bennett was a fortunate son, or rather a fortunate nephew. His father, Ralph, had been a sadly unsuccessful international merchant, but he was lucky to have two uncles, James on the left and Thomas Handison Perkins on the right, who were paramount traders in what for Americans was an emerging global economy. So Thomas and Bennett both left school early, before they were teenagers, early to clerk for their eminent uncles on India Wharf and Foster's Wharf. They often visited their uncles, especially James, who had a rather respectable place at Pine Bank along Jamaica Pond. It's an interesting story. Their good fortune would not relieve them of feelings of anxiety and foreboding. And Bennett's memoirs are filled with confessions of fret and concern, especially after their father passed away. He and Thomas, at a very early age, came to understand their duty, their responsibility to their mother, to their younger siblings, and in their early teens came to feel a sense of responsibility as their father was dying, responsibility as heads, as the new heads of the household. So they strived to be successful. They strived to become respectable. And they strived, of course, to make money with the purpose of sending it back home to their mother and to take care of the other kids. This sense of personal anxiety paralleled that of the new nation. We tend to think of the United States as confident and a bit self-important, a bit rowdy, but that wasn't always the case, and it certainly was not the case at the beginning of the nation's history. Following the end of the War of Independence, in 1784, Britain faced the question of how it would treat the new people, the Americans. It was a simple choice: reconciliation or retribution. The British public was inflamed with the loss of the colonies, and so Britain chose the latter course of retribution and proceeded to close Americans out of their familiar trade routes. And here you see November 1783. Even as the peace treaty is being signed, you find Lord Sheffield, very influential politician, writing his observations on the commerce of the American states. And he writes, we will make certain, we will send them to the Middle Ages, as it were. The Americans were not unaware of the obstacles their new nation would have to face. And I love this quotation from Fisher Ames, Boston politician, 1800. Until that contest, that is, until the American Revolution, a great part of the civilized world had been surprisingly ignorant of us, of the force and character, almost of the existence of the British colonies. They did not view us so much as a people, but rather as a race of fugitives whom poverty, solitude, and intermixture with the savages had made barbarians. So the Americans had much to prove. They had to establish a solid financial basis for this political contrivance they called a republic, they called an experiment, but they also had to prove that they weren't savages, that they weren't barbarians, that they should be accepted into the community of civilized nations. And so, closed out of their familiar ports, early in 1784, the first American ships sailed to China and to India, looking for new markets. Americans arrive in China, in Canton, in late August of 1784. This is 1 month after Congress had ratified the Treaty of Paris and 3 centuries after Europeans had established a trading base in China. And so we're latecomers. And the odds against latecomers usually are long and strong. Here we see, I love this fan. This was given to, as a gift, the captain of the first American ship to sail to China. She was called the Empress of China. And you see an image of her to the left of this fleet of ships in front of a pagoda. The island is called, the island's name was Huangpo, but the Americans had difficulty pronouncing Huangpo, and so they called it Whampoa. And so we have a famous image of the Empress of China on her first voyage, on the first American voyage to Whampoa. And this was the world that Robert Bennett Forbes had been born into. And these securities, both these insecurities, personal and national, framed his experiences when he left the offices of the Perkins brothers. He had been a clerk there. On October 19, 1817, he departed America aboard this ship, the Canton Packet. He was 13 years old, rather typical for the times. And he's going to travel the world. His first voyage and subsequent voyages will look something like this. His ship will stop at Cape Town, South Africa, for provisions, for food, fruit and vegetables to prevent scurvy, and for water, which we don't think about this much, but it goes bad in barrels and casks after a relatively short period of time. So the need for water as well as food was strong. In fact, that first American vessel I mentioned, the Empress of China, dared not stop at the tip of South Africa because the captain, Captain John Green, the captain, was very much afraid of what the British would say and what the British would do. He was very concerned that the British would try to confiscate his ship. So he bypassed Cape Town. Most American ships hereafter, though, will stop at South Africa. And then they continue into the Indian Ocean. They'll sail trying to avoid the roaring 40s in the Indian Ocean and off of Java, where the waves can reach heights of 60 and sometimes 70 feet. For the most part, the voyage is one of monotony, of boredom. And the journals, the diaries, the letters of mariners like Robert Bennett Forbes are filled with tales of boredom and homesickness. The ship is going to sail generally aiming for the Sunda Straits that divide Sumatra, the pepper-rich island of Sumatra, from Java, what is now Indonesia. And the plan is to anchor off of the Dutch port of Batavia on their colony island of Java. They're going to try to anchor here, and they want to pick up news as well as provisions. They might sell some of their wares here and pick up some goods that they could sell in China. And the next leg of the voyage will take them up through the South China Sea. Okay. The waters before this are filled with shoals and reefs. This is an extremely dangerous passage, so a captain needs to know what he's doing, and it's through these passages and seas such as these that Robert Bennett Forbes will cut his teeth as a young mariner and later captain. First stop is going to be Little Peninsula down at the mouth of the Pearl River estuary up through the South China Sea. And they're going to stop here at Macau. Doesn't look like this any longer by far. This wonderful stretch of beach known as the Praia Grande allowed them to anchor in relative safety from the notorious typhoons of the South China Sea. But this was not going to be a port of call for entertainment. Chinese regulations were strict, and the Americans found them invasive. It was necessary for ships flying a foreign flag to anchor here because they were considered by the Chinese to be outsiders, and not just outsiders, but they were known as outside barbarians. In the Cantonese, they were called Fangqua. And they were required to get permission to sail up the Pearl River. They needed to get a license called a chop to be able to travel into China or out of China. This one is not one that was picked up by Forbes. This was actually a chop belonging to a Salem vessel, but they pretty much look like this. It was on this occasion that the young Robert Bennett Forbes would have his first look at Chinese bureaucracy as the officials known as mandarins. This bureaucracy oversaw the rhythms and rituals of everyday life. Bennett Forbes and other American mariners described them as fearful personalities, and they were feared by the people of China for their cruelty and their corruption, at least as the Americans tell it. And of course, they would have looked extremely imposing to the 13-year-old who was making his first voyage to China. Upriver, an American ship would need to make as many as 5 different stops. Shops upriver. After Macau, a Fangqua ship would stop here at the forts of what the Portuguese called the Boca Tigris, that is the tiger's mouth. And here the ship would be inspected again and given another chop. For Americans who had rebelled over excessive government regulation, and for whom the phrase free trade was an anthem and a mantra, these Chinese regulations chafed. Americans protested repeatedly that these regulations were unnecessary and should not be imposed on them, but all to no avail. A ship would pass the solitary nail, Lin Tin Island, and this is a site that's going to figure prominently in Bennett's later career. We can imagine the teenage Bennett Forbes passing an array of strange sights, sea craft with their curious shapes, their rattan sails, and a pair of eyes painted on the bow. I think the bow would be over here, the bow of the vessel, so that the vessel can see ahead as the Chinese observed. Okay, my cursor, there we go. So junks like these, sampans, pagodas, rafts, and sailing upriver, nearing Canton, something that Bennett Forbes found unbelievable. The sheer size of Canton, something like 1 million people compared to Boston, so maybe 20, 25,000 by 1817. The size of the place, the vast numbers of people, the astonishing sight of whole families living aboard sampans, and the noise of firecrackers and shouting and singing and voices was just absolutely overwhelming to a young American who would be experiencing quite a bit of culture shock. As an American, as the Americans neared Canton proper, they would come upon this site. And this was the 13 European factories, each flying the flag of a different East India Company and a different nation. And here would be at last the site of something familiar. After perhaps 4 months at sea, the Americans could begin to feel a bit comfortable. By 1810, this is what young Forbes would have seen in 1817, 1818, the sight of the American flag. This is significant. This is important because it's a sign that the Americans had made it, that the new nation was being accepted by the European empires, the European superpowers. In 1817, 13-year-old Bennett would become, in the American factory, he would become reacquainted with his cousin, John Perkins Cushing, then 16 years old, and the director of the Perkins establishment in Canton. So I don't know how many of you would turn your careers over to a 16-year-old, but that's how they did it back then. Later, in the 1820s, Bennett's brother Thomas would rise to the rank of partner in the Perkins Company, and eventually the company consolidated and became Russell and Company. In Canton also, Bennett Forbes would meet the merchants, the Chinese merchants of the Kohong Trading Guild, a dozen or so at any one time, a tightly held trading community. And here we see a man who will come to befriend and support the Perkins family, Wu Ping Chen, known as Hao Kwa, will become a personal friend of, and not just a business partner and not just an acquaintance of Bennett, and especially of Bennett's younger brother, John Murray Forbes. They do a great deal of business together, and they do a great many favors for each other. Young Americans like Bennett Forbes or Thomas Forbes will make their way through the shops of Canton, but they especially value the art of Chinese craftsmen such as Spoilum. And one of their favorite activities was to purchase paintings of themselves, but even more of the Chinese Hong merchants with whom they did business. And so you would find back home in Boston or Salem, the parlors festooned with images of dear friends, of men with whom they had worked. So let's turn our attention to Forbes in the opium trade, a subject of some interest and some controversy. Um, in spring 1830, Bennett was home in Milton. He had never really settled down. He felt that he owed a great deal to his Perkins uncles, and they wanted him, they trusted him as a captain of their ships. And they sent him, as we've talked about, they sent him all over the world to collect cargoes and to buy and sell goods. They put a great deal of confidence in him. And consequently, Bennett felt a great deal of responsibility to carry out their interests in whatever way he was, and here's that word again, useful. In the spring of 1830, he's home in Milton when he hears of the death of his brother Thomas, he was positioned to take over the China firm, but the previous autumn, Thomas perished in a typhoon off of Macau. And so in the spring, Bennett consulted with his uncles. Actually, James had died, so he consults with T.H. Perkins, with James Sturgis, a partner of the Perkins firm, about his next steps. What he's most concerned about is his family. And this comes up again and again and again in Bennett's letters and in his books. And he tells us, he had laid up little money from my hard earnings. Being a captain apparently didn't pay as much as being a clerk. He had been devoted to the support of his family, and especially to taking care of his mother and to helping push forward his younger brother, John Murray. Now he felt the full weight of responsibility on his shoulders after his brother had died. After consulting with his uncle Thomas and with Sturgis, securing their support, Bennett and his younger brother, John Murray, sailed to Canton. John went to work immediately, clerking for Russell and Company, and Bennett sailed to Linton Island, to the Solitary Nail. You can make it out through the haze in the background here. He sailed a ship called the Linton, and this site was 8 or 9 years earlier. British merchants had moved their opium operations. They had been operating off of Whampoa Island, that little island you saw on the fan a little while ago. They had been operating out of Canton, but moving the product through Whampoa. But a new Chinese emperor had imposed greater restrictions and more surveillance from the mandarins on Whampoa. So British merchants had moved their opium operations to Linton, farther down the river and a little more out of the way to escape surveillance. This is where Robert Bennett Forbes would anchor his ship, the Linton. He's going to stay here until roughly 1832, so for a couple of years. He's going to just stay at Linton Island selling opium. Now, I have to clarify what he thought selling opium was all about. Previously, as a ship's captain for the Perkins firm, he had sailed to the Ottoman Empire. He had sailed to the port of Smyrna, and there he traded for Turkish opium. And he would bring that cargo, and here Smyrna is roughly right about here in the Ottoman Empire. He is going to become very familiar with in the bazaars of Smyrna with buying and selling opium. And this really begs the question, what exactly did he know about opium? What did he understand opium to be? And what 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 he knew was this. It was very different from what we know about pharmaceuticals and drugs today. Opium began to first be used during the American Revolution by this fellow, one of the founding fathers, Dr. Benjamin Rush, began to prescribe it at the Pennsylvania hospital. And from there, after the revolution, its usage took off. You begin to see more and more uh, medical dissertations, which were required back then, on opium. It was increasingly considered as a kind of wonder drug. And so the 1790s see increasing use of opium to relieve pain, as a stimulant, to keep the mind focused, and increasingly in the form of laudanum to quiet infants, teething infants, colicky infants, and so on. So there's a sense in Forbes' day, not a lot of debate, not a lot of controversy, a little bit, but Warren Delano of Russell and Company, I think, uh, was representative, was typical in describing as a merchant, I insist it has been fair, honorable, and legitimate, and no more objectionable than the importation of wines and spirits into the US. So Forbes imagines himself selling a commodity that is as useful as anything else and perhaps more useful than some of what he's selling. But he rationalizes selling opium also. Something curious is going on with him during these years of the 1830s because he will leave China, and as we'll see, he has to return. And he doesn't want to go back. He doesn't want to go back to China. He's very comfortable with his wife, Rose, and his child, Bob, but he's forced to go back. And he writes, perhaps Providence took away my fortune because I made it in opium. What I make this time will be free from that stain. So there's an awareness, an increasing awareness that something is not quite right with opium. And the way in which he rationalizes this, and the way Warren Delano and other American traders rationalize this, is that they insist they're actually not buying and selling opium. That is, they don't actually own the opium they're dealing with. They're simply commission agents. They serve clients who buy and sell opium. They serve clients by transporting, by warehousing, and by distributing the product, but they're not really owners of it. It is an immensely profitable product. The British had begun sometime after the War of 1812, around 1816, 17, 18. The British had begun to replace some of the goods they brought to China with opium because it was cheaper than anything else they could bring to China. And they could make a great deal more profit. In 1837, Forbes estimates that some almost 28,000 chests of opium were being sold in China at a value of nearly $20 million. That's an incredible amount of money back then. And he traces in one of his many books, he traces the remarkable increase in the number of opium chests from about 3,000 to about 20,000, and the remarkable increase in the value from about $3.5 million to about $11.5 million. So it's an extremely profitable commodity. At Linton, I mentioned that at Linton Island, Bennett anchors his ship permanently. For those 2 years he's there, it becomes a kind of warehouse, what they called back then a receiving ship. On the Linton, on the ship, ships would come from Turkey, they would come from India, and they would load the opium onto his ship. And Chinese buyers, smugglers, would come in at night, offload the cargo, and then bring it, just looking for my cursor here. And here you see a sale in chests of opium, and they would sell it up and down the Chinese coast, again, as far away from the observing eyes of the mandarins as possible. Some of it's brought in from Turkey, as I mentioned. But after the War of 1812, more and more opium comes in from India, especially from that northeastern province of Bengal, where the British East India Company has come to dominate politically, militarily, and economically. They hold once or twice a year, they hold an auction. They have forced the peasants of India to stop growing a diverse range of food products and instead grow only poppies. And every year or so at Calcutta, there's a great auction, and ships will come from all over to buy opium and to carry it to Sumatra, to carry it to Java, and especially to carry it to China. Okay, as we see here, it will be rolled into balls, laid out to dry, stored in great stacking chambers, and following the auction, carried in chests. Here you see Patna opium, and loaded aboard a fleet that will sail down the Hooghly River and sail to China and other points in the east. To get the opium to China and to get it there more expeditiously, faster, opium traders, opium merchants like Forbes will dabble in shipbuilding and navigation, and they will develop ever faster ships like these, and eventually even adding steam power. The Chinese have tried for over a century to prevent the sale of opium in China. They see this as an economic problem. They see it as a moral problem. They see it as a social crisis. And so Forbes has decided to get out of the business. He returns to Boston, he returns to Milton in 1832 after his 2 years aboard the Linton. He expects to never return to China again. He's made it. He's an established Boston merchant. He has partnerships with Russell and Company and other firms. Even before this, in 1828, he confides to Rose. I'm sorry, this is before Rose. He confides to his mother, during the 10 years of my seagoing life, I've not been on shore more than 6 months, and much of that time has been spent at Canton, very little at home. In 1834, he marries Rose Green Smith. He settles down as an eminent merchant. He invests in trade. He even invests in a Pennsylvania nail manufactory. He buys a house in Milton, which you have to go see. If you haven't seen this, you really want to see this. It is a magnificent artifact, if you will, of the American experience. Well, best laid plans and all of that. In 1836, Andrew Jackson, King Jackson, as he was called, decided to dissolve the Bank of the United States. This step ushered in a financial crisis that bankrupted firms throughout the Atlantic world, including the overgenerous and quite overextended Robert Bennett Forbes. By March of 1837, his business had fallen into what he called wild confusion, and he becomes desperate. He has one opportunity. His problem is he's lent out money to friends, and so they've all gone bankrupt, and his creditors call on him. There's one out for him, and that is something he very much does not want to do, and that is return to China and leave his wife and his 8-month-old son, Bob, back in Boston. But he's going to, in June of 1838, he's made plans. He's going to return to China. He's hoping to make his, what they call a lock. That is enough money, usually 100,000 Indian rupees. He hopes to make his lock and return home and never go back to China again. So he sails in June of 1838. He arrives in October of 1838 as a junior partner in Russell Company, Russell and Sturgis. And he's just going to work like a dog for as long as it takes. But as long as it takes is only going to be about 1.5 years or so, because in the autumn of 1838, 1,400 miles to the north, forces are being unleashed that will compromise his fortune and threaten his life. The emperor sends a special commissioner to halt the opium trade. Pardon me. His name was Lin C. Shu. He arrives in Canton in March of 39. He orders the foreign merchants, the Fanqua, to turn over all of their opium, about 20,000 chests of opium, for the sole purpose of destroying it. Forbes has made his lock, or as much as he's going to make, and he begins to think that the time is ripe to go back home. But it's not the opium crisis that sends him home in July 1840. Rather, he fell off a pony. He had a little riding accident, fell off a pony, was injured, and decided that he was so incapacitated that he would likely end his days in the Protestant cemetery on Macau if he didn't leave. Now, we've run short of time, so we're going to end here, but I'd be happy to take questions. So let me turn things back over to Gretchen, and I will stop the share.
All right. Thank you. That was fascinating. So we do have a few questions. The first one is, how did the British first get started selling opium?
Wonderful question. The British had been, well, first, this is a global economy they're in. The British had been trading with the Spanish, Veracruz, Mexico, Caribbean ports, Havana, and of course in Spain. The British had been trading goods for Spanish silver. And the Spanish silver is what they had been selling to the Chinese. It was the one thing that Europeans had that the Chinese wanted. And the Chinese had been filling their coffers with Spanish silver. This was becoming extremely expensive for the British as the supply of silver began to run out, the costs began to run up. And the British found that there was something of a market, a niche for opium in China. Now, they were in a perfect position to leverage opium because their conquest of much of India had allowed them, presented them with an opportunity. India was fertile ground for growing poppies that could be converted into opium. The British had already begun to impose their domination on what they called the jewel in the crown of their empire by forcing Indian peasants to pay exorbitant taxes and also to stop growing food crops and instead just growing poppies. By the 1820s, so starting even earlier, the British had begun to leverage this niche market for opium in China and really expand. And it's not the British government, but the East India Company, which becomes the marketing force for the production of opium in India and its sale and distribution in China. I hope I answered your question.
Seems like a good one. There are a couple questions wanting to know what happened. What happens to Forbes? He falls off the pony in China, heads home. And specifically, what happens when he gets back to the US and where is he buried?
Oh gosh, I don't know where he's buried. I'm sure there are folks from Forbes House Museum who could answer that question. What happens to Forbes is that he does not end his days in the Protestant cemetery in Macau. He does leave, he comes back, and he's much more cautious. He's learned his lesson. He's much more cautious in his business. And he, unlike his brother Jari, who becomes even wealthier through investing in railroads, Robert Bennett continues to, he prefers trade. He prefers trade in the global economy. He has made his luck and he invests it wisely. He becomes very wealthy. And after, a lifetime, he's in his 30s at this point, after a lifetime. And when I say lifetime, remember, at this time, the most privileged people in American society, white men, middle-class white men, die at about age 35, 36, 37. So he doesn't know how much longer he has. He has quite a while longer, but he doesn't know that. And so he settles down. He settles down in Milton. He's engaging in trade. His principal duty, I think he would have said, is taking care of his extended family, husbanding his resources, investing wisely, and he lives a very comfortable life. Now, you really must go to the Forbes House Museum because there's more to tell. And I'll add this piece. he becomes like the Perkins family. Um, his duty also includes, beyond the family, includes a striking sense of civic responsibility. The Perkins family contribute to hospitals, to the Perkins School for the Blind, to other, just a host of public service institutions. And Robert Bennett Forbes does also. When the famine breaks out in Ireland, he actually rents U.S. Navy ship, the Jamestown, fills it with provisions and sends it to Ireland. So his sense of service is what his life becomes from that point on. So I love that question because it really raises some interesting internal contradictions. On the one hand, people could label him as a villainous opium trader. On the other hand, people could extol him for his sense of public service. I think what he does is encapsulate the range of the American experience across the board.
Fantastic. And thank you to Suzanne Marsh, who let us know he's buried at Forest Hill Cemetery in Jamaica Plain, which I feel like maybe I should have known. But now we'll have to go over there and
Yes.
lay some flowers. Yeah. Can you talk a little bit more about Hukwa and his real friendship with the family?
Interesting fellow. He was not the first Hukwa. Sort of our version of Sir Hukwa, or Haukwa, as it's sometimes pronounced, was the third of his family to take on the title of Haukwa, and the third of that family to be a Hong merchant. Remarkably well-educated man, self-educated man, remarkably astute and remarkably kind. There are so many stories of merchants who he would call old friend, Western merchants, who fell into bankruptcy, either through no fault of their own or through mismanagement. And Hukwa would bail them out. And then when it was time when the merchant got back on his feet, he would come back to Hukwa and say, okay, I can pay you back now. And Hukwa would say, no, that's not necessary. We are friends. The relationship between John Murray Forbes and Hukwa seemed especially close. And when Forbes returns to the United States, when John Murray returns to the United States, he invests a good deal of Haukwa's capital into American railroads. And when Haukwa has been cheated, John Murray takes care of the legal arrangements and sues the debtor on behalf of Haukwa. Haukwa dies at some point, either during or just after the First Opium War of 1840 through 42. I'm sorry, I forget the exact date. And we might say he was something of a broken man. A lot of his friendships with Western merchants had been torn asunder. The center of economic power shifts after the First Opium War, shifts from Canton across the bay to Hong Kong. A lot of his American friends have left. A lot of his British friends have left. He's old, he's tired, and I think he ends his days economically comfortably, but it's bittersweet.
Sorry, I'm muted. There are a lot of questions, and we're not going to be able to get to all of them. So I think we probably want to stop with this one just to give people time. It's a beautiful day and I don't want everybody to be stuck inside. Also, thank you for everybody who has joined us from many, many different places. So not everybody has a beautiful day, but so here's a really interesting one. How does the Chinese government describe the story of the merchants like the Forbes and the Perkinses today?
Rather differently. It's a very different story, and it's a story that is not forgotten. And the Chinese will trace their animosity toward the West and their animosity toward the United States back to the opium trade. There are strong feelings expressed within Chinese, I don't want to say propaganda, but Chinese official documents that that the West took advantage of China, exploited China, and did so rather mercilessly for well over 100 years, 150 years. And so I believe that the position of the Chinese Communist Party is that they can't trust the West. They can't trust, because of a fraught history, they can't trust Americans. They can't trust other members of the Western community. And many of the disparaging descriptions that Americans have for China, the Chinese in turn throw back at the Americans. So it's been a fraught history. And it remains a fraught history. And the Chinese have not forgotten the opium trade, and they've not forgotten the opium wars.
Great. Well, I want to thank you, Dane, for that wonderful talk. There are a lot of, I guess they're not even questions or comments, that it was a bit of a cliffhanger, and people can tell that there is more to this story. So please do look for the email coming out shortly that will provide you with the details about going to the Forbes House Museum, because I think you can get some of the rest of the story of what happened to Forbes afterwards, and what happened to the family, and all the amazing things that he did. And then next year in 2022, when the opium trade exhibit goes up at the Forbes House Museum, we can all delve even further into that. There were a few questions about sort of how many people were involved and lots of details there, but we want to be mindful of the fact that we've spent an hour together. Thank you, Dane, so much for joining us today and providing that wonderful lecture. It was great. For the rest of you, everybody who attended, we appreciate you coming out, and we hope to see you at another Jamaica Plain Historical Society event in the future.
Gretchen, if people want, they can email me at Salem State.
Okay, I will put your email in the chat now, so people can send questions to that email address.
Or they can buy True Yankees.
There you go. That's true. That's another way to get the full story, is to read the book. All right. Well, thank you, everybody, and have a lovely afternoon.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Let's see.